Well, thank you so much for that overly kind introduction. And you're reminding me that I've always had this thing of liking to be a participant in some part of history, and that one, the history of boxing, I guess. But I also want to thank CIS, of course, for your hosting this event today, and I'm very pleased to be here. What I want to talk about is malign foreign influence in U.S. elections. Now, this might surprise some people, but 2020 happens to be a federal election year. So I wanted to start with some good news, which is that our election infrastructure, things like polling places and printed ballots, have been well protected, and that protection has improved over the last 3 years. With regard to the most recent 2018 midterm elections, both DHS and DOJ jointly found that there was no evidence that foreign actors had had any material impact on the integrity or security of election infrastructure or political campaign infrastructure that was used in the 2018 midterm elections for the United States Congress. Likewise, as the Senate Committee on Intelligence reported, there's no evidence that any vote totals were altered or changed by any foreign actors in the 2016 presidential election. But interference with infrastructure is not our only concern. We are also concerned about another threat that's known as malign foreign influence. And the key word is influence. Much of the time, that means something like disguised propaganda. Other times, it could mean the use of pressure tactics on influential people to try to have influence. It can also take the form of hacking and disclosing private emails or phone messages. Point is, it comes in many different forms, all designed to influence how Americans think about issues and how they cast their votes. There are good lists of these on the FBI and ODNI websites for those who are interested. We cannot escape the reality that the opportunities for malign foreign influence on our elections are far-flung. So it remains a challenge for Americans as voters. That did not end in 2016, but it didn't begin in 2016 either. Malign foreign influence efforts have been a long-standing concern in American elections, and that historical context can teach us some lessons. I'd like to use these remarks today and the conversation afterwards to discuss some of this historical context, then offer a few comparisons with what we've seen more recently, and finally to share a little bit of advice we can borrow from our historical predecessors. To begin, I think it helps to clarify a few definitions to describe what we mean by malign foreign influence, as opposed to what we might consider just legitimate diplomacy or candid expressions of legitimate national interest that all nations share with one another in appropriate ways. One definition that's easiest to remember is what we refer to as the 3 C's framework: coercive, covert, or corrupt activities by foreign governments to influence U.S. policies, U.S. political sentiment, U.S. public discourse, or to interfere in our political processes themselves. Under the 3 C's framework, we recognize that foreign governments often have preferences about U.S. policies or even the outcomes of our elections. Sometimes those preferences are expressed openly. Our government sometimes has open preferences about other countries too. When the preferences are open and attributable, no one is deceived or misled. But what we're concerned about is when foreign preferences manifest themselves through malign foreign influence activities that are, again, coercive, covert, or corrupt, whether their aim is specifically to influence our elections or to influence policymaking and public discourse more broadly. So one thing that has not been much noted in recent years is that malign foreign influence in elections has been a concern going all the way back to the founding of our republic. Using the 3 C's framework, I want to start with coercive activities. So if we go all the way back to 1787, when the founders were debating the merits of what was then our new Constitution, Thomas Jefferson told John Adams that he was, and this is a quote, apprehensive of foreign interference, intrigue, influence. Adams also worried, and this is his quote, "As often as elections happen, the dangers of foreign influence recurs," close quote. 9 years later, Adams and Jefferson squared off in the first contested presidential election in American history. The election of 1796 occurred while Britain and revolutionary France were locked in war. Adams favored the Washington administration's somewhat pro-British trade policy, while Jefferson favored the French Republic. A few months before the election, in his famous farewell address of 1796, President George Washington had issued a stern warning, quote, "Against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, I conjure you to believe me, fellow citizens, the jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake." Nonetheless, France tried to exert influence. The French minister of the United States, Pierre Augusta, told his superiors that he could get out the vote for a man devoted to France. That's a quote. He suggested that France should adopt measures that will cause the merchants to fear for their property and to make them see the need to place at the head of the U.S. government a man whose known character would inspire confidence in the French Republic. On the eve of that election, Adet sent the U.S. Secretary of State a series of letters effectively threatening that France would begin to seize American merchant ships and trigger war unless Jefferson were elected. Adet had them published in the Philadelphia Aurora, which was one of the most widely circulated and partisan newspapers of that era. The public threats, however, backfired. Adams, quote, "suspected they will have a contrary effect from what he intended," close quote. Adams was right. Jefferson's own confidant, James Madison, soon reported that Adet's action was an electioneering maneuver that could risk a perpetual alienation of the United States and France. So Jefferson's supporters disowned this interference in the election, while Adams' supporters resented it and saw it as an attempt to coerce voters. And Adams' colleagues reported that the exertions against the candidate Mr. Adet was understood to favor became the more determined and the more vigorous. Jefferson ultimately lost that election by 3 electoral votes. President Adams did not forget the risks that France's attempted coercion had posed. In his inaugural address, he implored the American people never to lose sight of the danger that foreign influence, by flattery or menaces, by fraud or violence, by terror, intrigue, or venality, presents to our free, fair, virtuous, and independent elections. That's a quote. The next year, Jefferson, too, objected to France's continuing coercive efforts to stir up American partisanship, telling his colleague Madison that he saw the efforts as very unworthy of a great nation. He felt that those efforts by France contributed to a mistaken presumption that Jefferson and his supporters' first passion was an attachment to France and hatred of Adams' party, when Jefferson felt the reality was that American voters' real passion was, quote, "the love of their country," close quote. So coming forward, since the 20th century, as the United States evolved into a superpower, malign foreign influence has been less about coercion and more about deceptive or covert efforts, meaning that the foreign government has tried to disguise or conceal its role. So in the 1930s, Nazi Germany, as an example, directed an extensive underground effort to influence U.S. public opinion. A German agent, for example, entered the United States claiming to be a clergyman and used Nazi funds to take over small established newspapers and some civic organizations until he was caught, indicted for failing to register as a foreign agent, and fled the country as a fugitive. Congress had responded to some of these Nazi Germany efforts and similar activities by enacting the Foreign Agents Registration Act in 1938, known as FARA, and that's a law that requires disclosure of some foreign influence activities. The Justice Department successfully prosecuted some of Germany's most useful American agents who had tried to hide their activities. But Germany also targeted U.S. elections, including the 1940 election, which occurred while World War II was underway in Europe. Nazi leaders had viewed President Roosevelt as pro-British and interventionist, so they employed several schemes for influencing the outcome of our 1940 presidential election, as well as trying to influence the platforms of the major political parties. One scheme entailed forging documents and fabricating stories that they hoped would capture the American public's attention. In March 1940, the Nazis released diplomatic documents they had supposedly recovered from the Polish Foreign Office's archives when the Nazis captured Warsaw. The documents purportedly showed that the Roosevelt administration had promised aid to Poland before the war and assured Poland that the United States would finish any war on the Allies' side. Germany's top diplomat in the United States, a man named Hans Thompson, called the documents a bombshell, and there were 2 members of Congress who demanded a congressional investigation. But most members of Congress, and even the American press, were more circumspect. They largely followed the advice that President Roosevelt gave them when the story broke, which was to take all European propaganda at this time with a grain of salt, which he then amended to stretch it to 2 or 3 grains. In the days before the 1940 election, Germany continued to try to plant fabricated stories, claiming they had evidence that Roosevelt had long been planning to intervene in Europe even before 1939. But no mainstream newspaper would take the bait. And Roosevelt, of course, was reelected. After World War II, the Cold War produced a whole new set of challenges from malign foreign influence. The Soviet Union employed covert or deceptive tactics as part of its so-called active measures, a phrase that it used to describe malign influence activities like disseminating forgeries, disinformation, and other propaganda, and sponsoring front publications to try to undermine American interests. Most active measures were actually directed abroad, such as when just a few weeks before the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles, the KGB mailed athletes from Africa forged letters supposedly from the Ku Klux Klan with threats against them. Or when the Soviets published stories in dozens of Soviet-controlled publications around the world claiming that the AIDS epidemic was started by US military experiments. But the Soviets also used active measures to try to undermine confidence or influence public opinion in the United States, including covertly forging documents and funding conspiracy-mongering books that supposedly tied the FBI and the CIA to President Kennedy's assassination, or supposedly tied FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to the Ku Klux Klan. And the Soviet Union also targeted US elections specifically. For example, during the 1976 Democratic presidential primary, the KGB adopted a wide-ranging set of active measures to try to disparage Senator Henry Scoop Jackson, who was a well-known anti-Soviet hawk, by instructing their agents to use confidential contacts to try to find what they called dark spots in Jackson's background. When they didn't turn up much, the Soviets sent a forged FBI memorandum dated in 1940 to the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, and to Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign, and the forged memo purported to conclude that Senator Jackson was secretly gay. Neither the journalists nor the Carter campaign published the phony document. After the 1980 election, Soviet leaders soon grew to loathe and fear President Reagan's administration, according to an ex-KGB defector, and they ordered the KGB to weaken President Reagan's 1984 re-election bid. Intending to discredit President Reagan by trying to portray him as a McCarthyite, Soviet agents covertly sent American journalists a forged letter dated from 1947, supposedly from J. Edgar Hoover, that purported to show President Reagan, before he was president, colluding with the FBI to root out communists in Hollywood. But the FBI publicly denounced the document when it surfaced in January 1984, and they explained that it contained stylistic touches that Hoover wouldn't have tolerated, and that it violated rules for FBI correspondence and was not authentic. That didn't stop the Soviets. They also covertly tried to develop contacts at the National Party committees looking for ways to subvert the Reagan campaign. And they developed a package of narratives they tried to disseminate about Reagan to portray him as a corrupt warmonger, subservient to the military-industrial complex, and responsible for tensions with NATO allies. But all of the Soviets' efforts failed, and President Reagan was re-elected in 1984. So let me turn then to the third C of malign foreign influence, having addressed coercive and covert. Let me talk now about corrupt measures to influence elections. One attempt was apparently made in 1968 when, according to the then Soviet ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrynin, quote, "The top Soviet leaders took an extraordinary step previously unprecedented in the history of Soviet-American relations and ordered him to offer then Vice President and Democratic nominee Hubert Humphrey secret financial aid for his campaign." But when Dobrynin asked Vice President Humphrey about his campaign's financial state, Humphrey replied that it, quote, "was more than enough for him to have Moscow's good wishes," close quote, and Dobrynin did not actually convey the offer. 6 years later, Congress made it illegal for foreign nationals to make campaign contributions. Fast forward just a little bit, a couple of decades, by the mid-1990s, that again became important when the People's Republic of China undertook a covert campaign to influence the U.S. political process through political donations and some other means during the 1996 election cycle. In that time frame, over Beijing's strenuous objection, Taiwan's president had been granted a visa in 1995 to speak at his alma mater, which was Cornell University, after Congress had passed some resolutions supporting that trip. The People's Republic of China, unhappy about that, then implemented a plan to influence the U.S. political process to be more favorable towards pro-Beijing policies by this concept of making campaign donations through middlemen who could provide access to and seek to influence candidates and elected officials at all levels of government. The Justice Department prosecuted a number of the middlemen who were involved, and a 1999 congressional report identified that PRC conduct as a serious threat to our national security. And more recently, with regard to the 2016 election, just last week, some declassified FBI documents were released by the Senate Judiciary Committee, which indicate that the Clinton campaign was warned about efforts by a foreign government to try to influence her through campaign contributions that, quote, "may come in a form outside established parameters for such contributions," close quote, from a foreign government. Again, we see the threat of corrupt, malign influence activities requires ongoing and continuing vigilance. So, malign foreign influence efforts in our elections has been a perennial problem. Is there anything different? Well, though the general threat isn't novel, some of the challenges that we're facing now are somewhat different. As President Trump put it in Executive Order 13848, quote, "In recent years, the proliferation of digital devices and internet-based communications has created significant vulnerabilities and magnified the scope and intensity. Historically, malign influence operations were often limited by their reliance on third parties, such as mainstream news outlets or popular magazines, in order to reach sizable segments of the American public. For much of our history, the media were cautious about being used in this way. For example, many American journalists wrote exposés about Nazi propaganda in the United States, and at least by 1940, the press was largely immune to it. Decades later, the FBI in the 1980s, in 1986 specifically, told Congress, quote, "The American media is sophisticated and generally recognizes Soviet influence attempts," close quote. But today the media environment is considerably different, and the internet and social media allow foreign actors to reach unprecedented numbers of Americans covertly, inexpensively, and directly, without necessarily having to go through the traditional media, without even having necessarily to set foot on U.S. soil. We are all now familiar with the findings that in the 2016 election cycle, the Russian Internet Research Agency, quote, spent a total of about $100,000 over 2 years on advertisements, close quote, on Facebook to promote social discord and division, and similarly placed disguised posts and tweets on several social media platforms. While the tools of malign influence have proliferated, foreign governments, such as Russia and China, have also become more sophisticated and more bold. Back in 1986, the FBI told Congress that Soviet active measures had relatively little success in the United States because they were often transparent and sometimes just clumsily implemented. Forged government documents, for instance, could be exposed. But the arsenal of modern malign influence, like impersonating Americans on social media platforms or manipulating digital content through deepfakes, can be more difficult to detect and counter, though it's something we have to attempt to do. As to the boldness issue, as FBI Director Wray recently pointed out, the People's Republic of China has been engaged in a highly sophisticated malign foreign influence campaign using bribery, blackmail, and other malign tactics to influence our year-round policy making, which certainly has implications for our elections. Beijing's methods are not always as blatant as its illegal campaign finance efforts were in 1996. The PRC tactics are more subtle, more pernicious, more complex. Beijing, for example, works relentlessly to co-opt seemingly independent middlemen who can influence members of Congress on a host of policies. That takes me to the question, what is being done about all these malign foreign influence efforts? And rest assured, as this old problem takes on new looks, the Department of Justice has been responding to these challenges with our own tools. I'll mention 5 of them today. First, the FBI has established a Foreign Influence Task Force that brings together cross-disciplinary and cross-regional expertise that encompasses counterintelligence, cyber, criminal, and even counterterrorism agents and analysts who investigate and work to counter malign influence by China, Russia, Iran, and other foreign actors. Second, the Department of Justice has been assisting social media companies, campaigns, and election officials in hardening and improving the resilience of their platforms, their networks, and their infrastructure against these kind of threats, and has been providing, where appropriate, defensive counterintelligence briefings and steps they can undertake to reduce vulnerabilities. Third, the Department of Justice has strengthened compliance efforts for the Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA, in order to identify and expose foreign influence. FARA helps to ensure transparency by requiring persons who engage in certain foreign influence-related activities to register with the Department of Justice and publicly disclose their activities. It doesn't prohibit any speech, but instead enhances the public's and the government's ability to evaluate foreign influence-related speech by ensuring that the source is clear. Fourth, where malign influence operations violate our federal laws, for example, as with something like hacking of email systems to make the contents public, the Department of Justice has brought criminal charges. The department remains prepared to bring criminal charges where they're warranted. And fifth, the department has supported the administration's broader efforts to counter malign foreign influence. For, as one example, the sanctions regimes. For example, the administration has imposed financial sanctions for Russian efforts to sow discord in connection with the 2016 election, and imposed further sanctions in the last 12 months for Russia's additional influence operations since then. In short, the Justice Department and our colleagues in government have been adapting to foreign actors' malign activities and actively combating and defending against them. Okay, at this point, I want to touch briefly on the current threat landscape as we head towards another election day. The Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and other federal agencies have engaged in unprecedented levels of coordination with and support to all 50 states and numerous local officials to ensure that their election infrastructure is secure. We have yet to see any activity intended to prevent voting or to change votes, and we continue to think it would be extraordinarily difficult for foreign adversaries to change vote tallies. We do, however, continue to see malign foreign influence efforts that are relevant to the 2020 election. Some foreign actors are covertly trying to undermine confidence in our elections because they're authoritarian governments who are opposed to representative democracy. And the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, or ODNI, recently made public in an August 7th public announcement some foreign governments have preferences about our elections and have taken or planned malign activities in support of their preferences, including efforts by China and Iran to undermine President Trump and his administration's policies, and efforts by Russia to undermine former Vice President Biden. The intelligence community, including the FBI, have briefed Congress as well as both presidential campaigns about these issues. And the ODNI has also taken unprecedented steps to educate the public about these threats, to better inform Americans so they can play a critical role themselves in safeguarding how our election works. We are working to counter all these influence activities, but it is important to remember that there are times when drawing attention to the threats can be precisely what the bad actors want: to generate concern and distrust, division and discord. And as Americans, we do need to avoid the temptation to seek political advantage from the revelation of influence activities that were explicitly meant to divide us. Instead, the right response is for our electorate to be knowledgeable and careful about the sources of information they rely on, to look for accurate information, to inform ourselves about the candidates, and to cast our ballots accordingly. In the words of Thomas Jefferson, quote, "I know no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society but the people themselves," end of quote. So let me offer some final thoughts about what the historical record tells us that Americans can do to protect ourselves from the malign influence efforts of foreign governments, in addition to the very strong measures being taken by the Justice Department and our colleagues across the government. First, we just need to be aware that malign foreign influence efforts have always existed, and they still do. It's one of the warnings, as I said, that President George Washington shared when he counseled Americans against the insidious wiles of foreign influence. The jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake. Second, this means we should not take information from foreign governments or questionable sources at face value. Information from countries or regions that have a history of propaganda should be taken with a grain of salt, if not 2 or then 3 grains, as President Franklin Roosevelt said. We've been warning the public that some foreign governments have a track record of spreading fabricated stories, disinformation, and propaganda to try to shape voter perceptions, and the intelligence community continues to share information about what those governments are doing in 2020. All Americans can control what information they rely on and can exercise care by evaluating that information with a critical eye. Finally, while we must always remain vigilant, Americans should not be deterred by participating in elections by concerns of malign foreign influence efforts. All Americans, in the end, can control who they vote for. Foreign propaganda and other influence activities have been concerns since the founding of our republic, but they are challenges that we've been successfully navigating for more than 200 years. The measures I've outlined today can help us to do so once again this year.